Hello, welcome to my kitchen and otherwise my yarn dyeing space. I'm Amanda Lee and I'm the owner, the maker, the knitwear designer, and the dyer behind Lovely by Lee. I also blog and I do tutorials. I am going to do a little yarn tutorial today. Think of it more like a vlog. You get a little bit of a yarn dyeing diary versus an actual tutorial because I do need to keep some secrets, right? First of all, I had a friend request a colorway for me on my fingering cotton yarn. It's been a really big hit this summer. I am dressed for summer. This is my ripple crop top designed by Jessie May. So we're going to just have a lot of fun with color today. So what's been requested for me with this colorway are sprinkles or speckles on cotton yarn. Cotton is usually more difficult to dye than other natural fibers or animal-based fibers such as wool and alpaca, but I found some tricks through trial and error in dyeing cotton yarn, especially with speckling. So I am going to go over my process and show you what I do just in my kitchen, and hopefully this is something that you can try at home. I do have an affiliate link for where I buy my yarn bases, which I would appreciate if you're to buy the bare yarn, if you would use that. It's at no extra cost to you, and you can find that link in the description. All right, let's get started. First of all, heavy duty gloves. I used to dye without gloves thinking not that big a deal, and it wasn't, but I would have usually blue or purple hands for 3 to 4 days. Blue is the one that tends to stick to your fingers and all the crevices the most. So I especially wear some heavy duty gloves. I believe these are just latex, but they are thicker than traditional medical grade gloves. So they can be found at Home Depot in their painting section, probably in some of their other chemical sections. I've had mine for so long because I buy them in bulk, I'm not even sure where I have purchased them. But another thing you will need is obviously your bare yarn. I purchased my bare yarn in hanks, ready to go. I haven't always done that, and sometimes I still don't, as I find a gorgeous yarn base, which is sometimes already caked or is in a ball. And in that case, I have to wind it into a hank. So you're essentially unwinding it, putting it into this form. And then you want to be very careful with how you tie it because you do not want the yarn to tangle. It's usually done in 3 sections. For example, you can see this hank here has 3 twists, so it's done in 3 sections, and that just helps the yarn from tangling. But another trick that I use is just these little plastic shower curtain hangers, and I put that around my yarn, or zip ties. I've seen other dyers use zip ties, and this way it keeps the yarn from traveling. For example, as I was putting this on, just this one here wanting to fall, and if that happens, just one strand, and it's happened to me before, sadly and embarrassingly, when you put it on your Swift to cake your yarn, it will create a big mess, just that one backwards piece of yarn. So I am gonna put this on just like that, and then when you are moving it from the dye pot to the sink to hang to dry, this really helps out and keeps these sides separated. It's even wanting to tangle a little bit right now, or you know what, see, exactly my point right here. I think I had missed some of that. Oh my goodness, that would have been a disaster. Okay, so I'm actually going to find where one of these areas where the hank is tied right here. That's going to help group it together. I want to double check. I should have been more careful when I had done this the first time. Also, this is really my first time doing a tutorial. This is obviously for my YouTube channel, which is new. So give me some slack. I hope I will get better. I hope I'll get better and learn a lot. But I'm used to doing these things on a live. I actually, that might be interesting to do sometime, is just do my lives and then obviously save and record them. Oh, we can do that on YouTube, can't we? I'm very naive and new to YouTube. There's quite a few YouTubers that I watch daily. Oops. But I've never been on this end of it. Part of the reason why YouTube is a bit intimidating, and I mean, it happens everywhere, right? But I'm not going to deny, I see some mean and cruel people on YouTube. And while some of it's just ridiculous and trolls having fun, I don't know if I was ready for that quite yet. I guess here goes nothing. I've been trolled before on some of my other platforms. I do have, I think my largest platform is my Instagram. And then I also do quite a bit on Facebook and Facebook groups, and that's where I hold and host my testing calls. I do have a TikTok account, which I'm also still learning. I'm one of the old people on TikTok, as I've learned, and then now new to YouTube. I haven't ever really used Twitter. I didn't understand it. I had it automatically linked to my Instagram account, where when I would post to Instagram, it would go to Twitter, but I didn't know how to use it. I didn't interact with people on it. But I don't know. I'm all for giving it a shot, reaching other people. So I have my yarn ready to go. I wanted to tell you a bit about how I prep my station. Obviously, you want it clean. With being in a kitchen, you want to make sure everything is sanitary, wipe everything down. I tend to bleach everything. I just want a very clean environment for when I begin. I use my sink for rinsing and soaking. I know a lot of dyers, especially if they dye in bulk, they tend to use buckets or even tubs to soak their yarn. Since we're doing such a small batch right now, I'm only going to use my sink. For my dye pot, I had just invested in this large stainless steel catering pan. It's deep, it's enough. I could fit my 3 skeins in there, or 3 hanks in there. I usually don't go over 3. But if you're doing, for example, I'm wanting to match this colorway, I want them to be very close together, so I'm going to dye them all together too. Depending on what kind of dye you're wanting to achieve, if you're just wanting to do tonal or a solid color, you can just use like a big old spaghetti pot. But I find this interesting for my speckling, which I'm going to do. And I mentioned speckling cotton yarn is usually more difficult than speckling some of the other yarns, but I will walk you through that process. So, I'm going to first soak this yarn. I have my hanks, and there's so many places in which you can find bare yarn. There's a lot of different companies, and honestly, I use a lot of them. But one of my go-tos is Knit Picks. I get their bare bases. I tend to buy them in bulk, but you can also buy the hanks individually. They have fingering to super bulky and a variety of different fibers. So again, you can find that link in the description if you're interested in looking. For dyes, I also use a variety of dyes. I know for cotton, different dyes are usually recommended because part of the problems people find with cotton is that it's not as vivid, or certain colors don't want to stick. I'm going to show you a few tricks that I do for my cotton, but you can always expect different colorways to take to different fibers differently. For example, if I were dyeing superwash wool, that usually takes color the best, in my opinion. It doesn't take a lot of wait time, it tends to soak up all of that color, and by the time you rinse it, it's pretty true to color. Alpaca, I love alpaca. It's so soft, but it's quite difficult to dye. I have dyed alpaca blends, and I've even recently tried dyeing hand spun alpaca, which was brown. It wasn't treated at all. The fiber did feel a little bit conditioned, which is expected coming straight from an alpaca, but that was a disaster. I found that I could not get the dye to stick to that without chemically bleaching it, or similar to how you would dye your hair. First you have to bleach it and treat it before you add the color. That was just too raw of a fiber to have any of the color really stick, but we were able to tone it down. But a lot of alpaca is going to dye much lighter than if you do the exact same process with a superwash. Cotton is usually similar, except with certain colorways. So what I find works best with cotton are finding the dyes that are typically used in tie-dye kits, because you're usually tie-dyeing a cotton tee, right? So I tend to find tulip dyes stick very well to cottons. And another secret to dyeing cotton yarns, you know, it's more of a cold dyeing process than heating it up on the stove and letting it simmer. I will actually soak my yarn and let it simmer on the stove for a bit, my cotton yarn, and then I let it cool to lukewarm temperature. That's when I start dyeing, and then it will cool entirely in the process, and then you let that dye soak on the cool base. So I am going to soak this in the sink. Cottons are suggested to be soaked in soda ash and water. I actually use vinegar just as I would with a lot of my acid dyes, which with the acid dyes you can use citric acid or vinegar. I prefer vinegar. I know not everyone's a fan of the scent, but I find I can rinse a lot of it out, especially with some of my washes that I do. So I've already put just some white vinegar in my sink, and I am going to run some hot water, and then I will put in the yarn, and I'll let you see what it's like when it soaks. I have ran my hot water as hot as I could get using my tap faucet or my sink faucet. And I am just going to set these in there. And then I'm going to push them down, because you want all of the yarn to be entirely soaked, saturated. And cotton takes a while to absorb all of that moisture. So that is a huge trick to dyeing cotton, is making sure it's fully soaked. And I actually tend to use the sprayer and just like a shower head, and try to soak all the pieces that may seem, or the areas that may seem like they are not soaking up enough water. But yeah, just really let it sit in there. Give it a stir every once in a while. If you need to put a bowl or something on top so that it stays under the water to help soak it up, that's an option as well. But I think too many people fail when dyeing cotton because they don't let it soak enough, or it's not wet or damp all the way through. So that is a big trip there. I wanted to show you what the cotton looks like now that it's been sitting in this hot water. It is actually really hot. And it looks like, see right here, it looks like it's all wet and soaked, but it's not. Right here, there's just some areas that are not quite soaking up that water. So that's what I mean, that it really needs to be saturated. Really put it under the water, spread out the fibers and the strands, wave it through the water, spray it again with the sprayer or the faucet, and try and get all of those pieces wet. See, there's some dry pieces right there. It's tricky. I can tell you about the colorway that we will be dyeing for my friend. She actually has already purchased some of my strawberry lemonade colorway, which is a golden yellow base, and it has speckles and tonals of a strawberry pink. It's beautiful. She wants to find a yarn that complements it, yet is also contrasting. So we discussed colorway options, and she's wanting just a creamy white base. So I'm gonna keep the base bare, and she wants it speckled with the same colors in the colorway and maybe a little bit more. All right, so I have separated my powdered dyes, And since we're going to be sprinkling this, there's not very much at all. There doesn't need to be. A little bit goes a long way, especially with only 3 hanks of yarn. So I have that golden yellow. I'm mixing 2 different yellows, as I had said, and they're going to be from two different brands. So we're going to see. And I have this lovely magenta. It's more like a fuchsia, but on the cotton yarn, it dyes to be a bit more of a strawberry pink. It's really pretty. And then I have my turquoise in here. Now with speckling, and I can already see in between the dyes, speckling is likely to break, which means when you put the color on the yarn, even if you sprinkle it on lightly, all those tiny little pigments are likely to separate, and it may be black that you're speckling with, but that black might break and you may get colors, you might get blue, red, and yellow, the primary colors. Most dyes will do that unless they are primary colors. So if you're using a yellow or a red or a magenta, cyan blue, those typically will be true to their color when you speckle with them, but any variation, even of primary colors, are likely to break a little bit, which I find fun. You get a little bit more color in your sprinkling or speckling, but not everyone's a fan and not everyone understands that when you do that, it's likely that some of those colors will break. I think we're gonna get very minimal breaking with these colors, but the one I'm most concerned about is actually this turquoise, because and again, it's not gonna be the same color as this egg container, it's just what I'm storing it in. This turquoise, I can tell, has bits of dark green to make it turquoise with the blue. I'm sure, yep, I can see tiny flecks of yellow. I'm gonna try and get a close-up of that. Maybe I'll dump some on some paper and see if I can show you the different colors in dye and why, when you sprinkle it on any fiber, why you might get some of the breaking up of the colors. Also, here is some of that turquoise, and I poured it out on a piece of paper so that you can see all of the different pigments that make up that turquoise. There's actually some flecks of red, which I thought were dark green, and the big groups of the turquoise, and there's even some yellow to give it a bit of that greeny color in there. So it's likely when this is sprinkled on the yarn, those bits of red and yellow are going to land on different areas of the strand, and it will dye it, it'll give it a little sprinkle of pink or yellow, and that just happens sometimes. I do think the yarn has been soaking enough. I'm going to get started on the speckling. This is going to be a different process than if I were making a tonal colorway or a variegated colorway, which is multiple colors, if I were wanting to dye the entire yarn, in other words, or a big chunk of it. Since I'm not needing the dye to spread all around, and I don't want it to, I don't want it to bleed throughout the strands, which is usually a really beautiful process with certain dyes and yarns, but since I want that condensed sprinkling, I'm actually going to place this in my catering pan and not add any extra water. So if I were doing this as a tonal, I would add more water to the bottom of the pan. I'd probably add a little bit of the dye to the bottom of the pan, place the yarn on top, and then I would fill it with some extra water and pour the dyes on my yarn. I am just going to take the yarn, I'm not going to wring it out, which you don't want to wring yarn anyways, it can really affect the structure of the fiber. So I'm going to just pick it up and place it in the pan. It's going to be wet and soaked. There's still going to be water that falls to the bottom of the pan. But I'm not going to have all that water pooling where it's going to carry the colors to other parts of the yarn. So I'm going to just, I don't know if you can see me, do this. So you can hear my daughter bouncing around up there. So I'm going to actually kind of wave it in the pan. I will show you a close-up of this in a bit. And kind of spread it out. Especially with speckling, you want to spread out the strands so that you can get them in the back of the hank, and so you're not just dyeing the top, because as you knit that, one section of your yarn will be heavily speckled, or it will be more like the base, and then if you're doing a bottom-up knit, you might get a lot of speckling on the bottom, and then it would be more like a fade of speckling to the top. So you want to make sure you get it evenly speckled. I know some people will even speckle one side of their yarn and turn it over, speckle the other side. I have done that before. I have done that, but in this case, I don't think I'm going to have to do it with this one. Thank goodness, because that is a lot. That is a lot. So here I have all of the cotton noodles in my pan, and I wormed the pieces in there, and now I'm going to separate as much as I can. You want a lot of these really spread out, and sometimes I even take some of the back of the yarn, put it on top and spread it out. So you really want the speckles to be varied throughout this yarn. Okay, now we're ready to begin speckling. I put my gloves on, really important, I promise. And I'm gonna start with my yellow, since it is the base for the other colorway in which we're complementing. I'm noticing there's a lot of golden, yellow, there's some magenta. I'm curious to see how this is gonna break. So what I'm going to do, some people use salt shakers or sifters. I'm just gonna very, very carefully and lightly sprinkle it over the top. And that's kind of the great thing with cotton yarn, and when it's cooler and when you don't have a lot of that water for it to travel, it's not going to catch that water and bleed through. So I am just going to lightly sprinkle. Now a lot of times the dye too, until it's wet, you don't see the color, but once it hits that damp yarn, then you start to see a bit more of the color. And I will show you in just a moment. In fact, I'll save that last little bit and I will show you what it looks like as I'm sprinkling it. Okay, so you can see in some areas where I sprinkled that yellow, and notice how when the color hits the yarn, it starts speckling right away. It's sometimes nice just to do half of your color to see where it's going to hit where it's damp. And I'm going to go in with this lovely magenta. This is actually a fuchsia mixed with some petal pink. So now I'm going to kind of do the same sprinkling process. I don't mind if it overlaps on some of the yellow. I always think that's a pretty part too. You just get some more speckles. And also try and go across the yarn so that you get all three hanks before you run out, instead of just doing like maybe the one closest to you. Go all the way across it and then zigzag back and forth, if that makes sense. And I'm going to get some over here. I might be out of the view, but not much. That's just really light speckling, and I'm always tempted to add more. I think, is that really going to be enough? Start with that and honestly let it sit a little bit before you add some more colors. So now we're going to get the turquoise, and this is the one I'm mostly concerned about because I don't know what colors it's going to break into. If it breaks into these colors that I already have, no big deal, right? But I'm ready to start, and I might just do a little section of the turquoise, so there'll be zaps of it. Maybe I'll just do this straight line. I'll go across all three hanks. Maybe I'll just kind of really condense it in that area. Ooh, that'd be really fun. Ooh, look at that. We'll just get a nice, lovely blue zap, a turquoise zap. Ta-da! So I am going to let this sit for a while. So now it's been about 20 minutes, and this is my final step. You want to make sure that you let the dye really soak and saturate before this step, because this is going to spread out some of those speckles a little bit. It will cause slight bleeding, but it's also going to make sure all of that remaining dry dye gets soaked up by the yarn. So I have a mixture of rubbing alcohol and water in a spray bottle. And I'm just going to lightly spritz. You don't want to get too crazy, but just give it a good spritz. and then let it soak for another 10 minutes. And you will see some of that color really spread out among the yarn. Those condensed speckles, they're just going to lightly spread out, but they're still going to hold its shape. If you were to do this sooner, say when you first sprinkled on the dye, that color would just bleed right away and you wouldn't get those nice little speckles. Now also, while some areas don't look like it's very speckled, you have to remember that each of these are a single strand of yarn. Let me lift this one up, for example. So look at that. So when you knit with it, each tiny little speckle is going to be about 1 stitch. And so it will speckle throughout the yarn. Oh my goodness, look at that. So that's why you don't want to do too much, why less is more, because even while it looks like I have this big old condensed blob right here, when it's knit, that's just going to be 1 or 2 stitches and it's going to be beautiful. This is soak, and it can be used on garments or yarn, wool, cotton, all sorts of things. So after I let the dye soak, we will rinse it out in the sink. Give it a rinse first, and then in the other side of the sink, I like to make a little bubble bath. I use about a capful to gallon of water with this. There's lots of different scents, and there's other brands too. I'm not saying this is the type of soak you need to get, or wool wash it's also called, but some kind of a hand wash soap. Make sure you double check and make sure it's gentle on yarns, different types of fibers, wool, cotton. But this one, I think the scent is yuzu. I'm assuming it's kind of fruit, maybe it's citrus. I have a pineapple one, and then I have a lavender sage from a different brand that I just love. I don't know what that reminds me of. It's good. I like that. It's not over the top fruity. It's kind of like a floral fruity fragrance. I'm gonna leave that in there. And then also to dry your yarn, it's okay to hang it as long as all the color is rinsed out. You can hang it on the back of a chair, something else, put a towel under it, or just invest in one of these dryer racks. They're like 20 bucks. You'll use it a lot. I can dry a lot of different skeins on here. Dries best in warm rooms. If there's a breeze or a fan, that's just gonna help. After the dripping is done, if we are indoors, say it's winter and I can't take it outdoors, or if it's a time of year when insects are heavy, you don't want to let it dry outside, but I will find one of our floor vents and put the drying rack over that after the drippings are done. Otherwise, keep the towel there, because you'll probably learn this in some of my future videos. Sometimes you get color that will just continue to bleed even after you've rinsed it several times. The color will still dye the yarn and it doesn't necessarily wash out, but some of that pigment is really, really, really hard to rinse out. Reds and blues especially. So if you are dripping the water on your floor, it could dye it that color. So just be cautious of that. In a lot of cases, especially when you use the less is more, that yarn will soak up all the excess dye. If you're doing a tonal or variegated yarn, you should use as little dye to get the color that you want, but then the water should be clear afterwards, because the yarn will soak up all that color pigment and then you will have clear water. That is a successful dye session. We are ready to rinse. I'll just try and hold this up like this. So our speckles stayed put. That's what we wanted. And I'm going to bring it over to my sink, and I am just going to find my hooks. You know what? I should put my gloves back on. I need to wear my gloves. I do this all the time. Many of us dyers do. Then we have blue and purple fingers. Put my dye gloves on. Feel like Dexter. I loved that show. So I'm just going to lift this. I know I'm kind of out of view a little bit. I'm going to put it in the sink. I'm not going to put it in water, sitting water or anything. I'm just putting it in a drained sink, and I'm going to spritz it off before I give it its bubble bath. There is some remaining dye in the pan that will need rinsed out later. Not a lot of extra moisture. And then I will spritz this off. I'll try and show you what I do when I rinse off the dye. But before I do, and I feel like it's safe enough to do this because this yarn really soaked up all those colors, but look at that. Now, because we let it set for such a long time, we should be safe enough to rinse it and not lose that color. A lot of times with cotton, what happens is it looks vivid, everyone's excited, and then you rinse it and it literally rinses off. It's down the drain, and then you're back to your white base. Just to make sure when I start this, I'm only gonna rinse a little section of it and make sure those colors stay put. So I'm gonna do that before I get right into my rinsing because it's just a good idea to do that. Find like the last little inch of the yarn, rinse that and see if that color goes anywhere. If it does, all you have to do is take the yarn back to the pot, let it sit, let it soak in longer. If the yarn has dried up or lost its dampness, just spritz it again with some water and just let it sit there for a long time. Unfortunately, not all dyes are going to take, but I think the trick with cotton is just letting it sit for a very long time, sometimes overnight. With speckling, I don't think it's necessary because it's so concentrated on there. But if I were doing a tonal, and again, this is just one dye lot I'm gonna do so many different styles of dyeing for you, I can't wait. But sometimes you have to let it sit for 24 hours. It's the secret, and why a lot of people do not dye cotton is because of that reason, which is understandable. It's a long time, especially if you're doing it in your kitchen. It takes up a lot of space, but just make sure that sits on there, make sure that the color is penetrating the yarn. And I forgot to mention, I'm wondering with all this editing stuff, this is not gonna be my best video. But I'm wondering, or not wondering, well, my goodness, see, I'm trying to make my point, but I'm going to all these other places. I was wondering if I should edit it in the beginning of why I soak it in vinegar or why cotton is soaked in soda ash. It's really important, but I might just do it here. It's a treat for making it all the way through. A little egg. So the vinegar or soda ash, similar to when you color treat hair, it will open up the fiber. It kind of breaks down that protective, some of the oils sometimes on it. Cotton doesn't so much have oils, that's why soda ash is preferred, but with some of the wools, it will wash away and strip it of those natural oils. And it helps just color pigment to stay. Similar to when you dye Easter eggs and you mix the dye into vinegar, and it tends to make the shell a little bit more porous, and then that dye sticks. Similar thinking, at least to me. I don't know if that's accurate. Okay, I did a little sample. The dye is not running off, it's great, but you can see that the turquoise is obviously a lot lighter blue than when it was on the yarn before it was rinsed, which is purposeful, and it is turquoise, so it's not going to be as bright and vivid as other colors. Let me show you over here because I have not rinsed this one yet. So I am going to turn on my sprayer. I'm using cold water. Let's see. Sorry, my arms are kind of awkward. I'm trying to get this in view. And these help you onto it so it's not going down the drain. You just give it a nice spritz. I try and wash off any extra color. There's a little bit of runoff, it looks like, a little bit of extra blue, but it's still on my yarn. It's not washing out of the yarn, so that is what is important. So I'm just going to go ahead and rinse off the remaining hanks. Looks beautiful. some of the areas where the yellow had bled with the turquoise, it's kind of a gorgeous lime green. That's going to be really fun, especially knowing the yarn that this is going to be paired with. All right, so I'm not even going to wring that out or anything. In the next sink, I'm going to add my capful. You can see I have some yarn soaking in there now. I'm going to add my capful of soak, and then we will let that yarn just sit in a nice bath for about 15 minutes, and that's the last of it. Then we will lightly squeeze it. I'll show you that process and have it out to dry. Look at this lovely bubble bath. So I'm going to take our yarn and set it in the soak. This also removes that vinegar smell. Oh, it's like a kaleidoscope. I'm going to push it down, similar to when you soak it before you dye it. You want it to really get to every strand. It's just like washing hair, sort of. I guess we don't really wash our hair in a sink like this, but the concept is the same, how you want to wash the yarn. And you don't want to agitate it too much. You don't want it to tangle, but you do want to get those bubbles and soap. It's going to help it smell so good. And these bubbles will then eventually die down. When that happens, you're done. You don't have to rinse it. This is a wash. Most wool washes or soaks do just that. They stay in the garment. Well, this is definitely sudsy, and we are going to move on because it's soaked long enough. So I've taken it out of the bubble bath, and I'm just going to lightly squeeze. I'm not twisting, I'm not wringing it out. Kind of makes it a little bit curly, and the curls will not stay in the fiber. That just means it's really conditioned from this soak. But see how it's still sudsy? I might rinse it off a little bit more. We don't want it that sudsy. It's okay if a little bit stays in there because it just makes it nice and soft and it smells nice. Sure, oh my goodness, there's just no kidding. You're just gonna get kids and dogs in the background. Welcome to my life. And then I might give it a nice squeeze like this. And I'll lay it flat on the drying rack. So this is my yarn after it's not dry, it's soaking wet. But see how just over time with it hanging, those curls are no longer in the cotton. And then you can still see all the gorgeous speckles. So pretty. Now cotton takes a very long time to dry. It's probably 3 times longer than wools. I would bet this is going to take at least 24 hours to dry. It's very hot outside, so it might dry quicker if I put it outside, but if I can't watch it, I do get concerned about that with some of the bugs outside this time of year. And of course inside we have our air conditioning on, and with our air conditioning this just doesn't quite dry as fast. But I will let it sit, and tomorrow I will show you progress on this. I will be dressed differently, let's hope, and you can see how this yarn dries up. So, hello, it's been 2 days since I dyed this lovely speckly yarn, and it almost took that long to dry. and I won't deny I've just been very busy. But now it's entirely dry, so I want to show you a close-up of this yarn, as drying sometimes makes the colors lighter a little bit, especially on cotton. In this case, I think they're pretty true to color after rinsing. They're not as bold as when they were in the dyeing pan, but after rinsing, I think it's pretty close to color, even with drying. And I'm going to show you how I hank my yarn by hand. It's not as tight as other yarn companies may do, mostly because I do it by hand and I'm not as strong. And some of those companies, or even some dyers, do have a machine that helps twist their yarn for them. But I will show you what I do. I have one in hank form right here, just to kind of show you. It doesn't look bad. It doesn't look bad. I do feel like sometimes when I purchase hanks from the store, they're much tighter, but to be honest, I kind of like them a little bit more loose because I feel like it respects the fiber and doesn't pull and stretch it out. Same thing, I'm gonna go off on a little tangent here. When yarn is caked up and not used right away, it can also stretch out and affect the fiber too. Same way as when you knit with a fiber and decide to frog it and use it again, you have all the little kinks from the stitches in it. That's what happens if your yarn is caked tightly, or if it's hanked too tightly. But it also is a great way to package to be sure it doesn't tangle or unwind. So here we have, oh, look at those delicious speckles. There we have that magenta and that golden yellow. We have some splashes of the turquoise. That's not wanting to show up as much in that light. When I back away, you can see it. And again, when this knits up, you're going to get a lot of the bare space. And where these areas are speckled, even the areas where the speckles seem to have bled a little bit, when you knit with that, that's just going to be 1 or 2 stitches, depending on what you're making. And so it's still going to be speckles within the yarn. So it will knit up beautifully, I promise. So here, I'm going to hank it, and then I will put the yarns on, or the hanks on, a white background so that you can see all these colors up close in that way. So what I do when I hand hank my yarns is I actually put like my 2 fingers, my middle and index finger and thumb, around my yarn to hold it, and then I use one hand to just twist it, and I pull and I twist it, and I do try and get it rather tight. But if it's too tight, then it is kind of hard to close the hank at the end, which I'll show you what I do. So here I have it pretty tight. I usually use my knee to fold it in half because I want it to start to crease right in the center, and sometimes with the twists it might do it on the side or whatnot, but I'm going to use my chin because my knee is out of view. So I'm just going to kind of bend it here where I want it to start. Oh, see, that didn't work. It's wanting to twist a bit more to the side. I'm going to use my knee. I apologize that that was out of view, but I hope you get the idea. And even so, I still feel like this is a little bit uneven, not much, but you can still manipulate the hank a little bit. And then I go through the hole that I had from the twisting, and I take the other side and you go through and you pinch it, clasp it, and then you just pull it through. And then here, see, now I need to kind of rearrange my hank a little bit. Sometimes if I'm able to crease it right in the center, I don't have to do much manipulation, but look at that. Oh, it's so lovely. So that's how I hank my yarns. Sometimes I add a label around the outside. If they're bigger hanks, I found that putting a label like right through here and stapling it or taping it on the side is a great way to label your yarn too. So here we have these 2. I'm gonna do the 3rd one, and then you can see a close-up. And here they are. So gorgeous. It's very summery. If I were to name this, I might call it printer ink because the colors remind me of those in a printer. I've already learned so much from the first part of this video as I was editing and putting it together before I filmed this today. I have a lot of work to do. I grow and learn from everything. It's the educator in me. So I hope I can only get better and offer great content for all things knitting. If you would like to see more, I do have a blog at www.lovelybylee.com. I do sell my knitwear patterns and also my yarns, and you can find links to all of my goodies at my website as well.